After seeing the other video from Immersis Tech called What British Soldiers Thought About American Soldiers in World War II, the following viewers requested that I reverse the question and let's find out what the Yanks thought of the British soldiers in World War II. I apologize in advance if I missed anyone else who suggested this. Francis Lepresto, Oliver Sherman II, Jim Halpert, Be Still Bub, Mark Tresp, Patrick Miano 7901, John McMickle 5685. Thanks for the suggestion. It's always appreciated when viewers request a video. We'll go over what the United States soldiers thought about British soldiers and the people of the United Kingdom. The battle portion is near the end of the video. When Americans started arriving in the United Kingdom in January 1942, almost all of them had never left the United States before, and this was a new experience indeed. They liked the fact that English was the common language, but they had to get over some of the misunderstandings of some words and slang. Before their arrival, American soldiers were warned about mannerisms and their habits in Army guidebooks. Don't be a show-off. The British dislike bragging, and it isn't a good idea, for instance, to say bloody in mixed company. It is one of their worst swear words. To say, I look like a bum, is offensive to their ears. For to the British, it means you look like your own backside. One soldier told a British woman that he liked her fanny, which is an older American way of saying that he liked the way her butt looked. But she called the constable on him because to the British, that was much more vulgar than he realized. Other American soldiers from the South didn't like being called Yanks and openly declared that they were Confederates. There were fistfights over this. It took them a while to understand that the British called all Americans Yanks and that no offense was intended. To go back in history from before the American Civil War, many of the Americans who ventured over to Europe were called Yankee traders, as they came from Boston or other New England ports. So, the British used the name Yanks to represent all Americans. After more and more U.S. soldiers were deployed to Great Britain, housing started to become a problem. By the time the war was over, about 3 million U.S. soldiers had passed through Britain. Even if they were there for only a short while, temporary housing had to be available. The U.S. Army established camps in the countryside, which sometimes greatly outnumbered the local surrounding villages. After the D-Day landings in early June 1944, most of the Allied soldiers went to the continent to fight the German occupiers, and housing was no longer the pressing problem that it was. Many white American soldiers were racist in World War II, and they expected to be able to have segregation like it was back home. The British had other ideas. An entire video could be made about this topic, but we'll briefly go over it. The United Kingdom was almost entirely white in the 1940s. There may have been only about 7,000 black Britons at that time. Slavery had been abolished in the British Empire since the early 1830s, and there was no history of segregation or whites-only pubs as there was in the United States, and especially the South. So the point is that this was a foreign concept to the British people and to their soldiers. Due to the Jim Crow segregation laws in the South in the early 1940s, and the segregation of the United States Armed Services, many black and white soldiers fought the same Axis enemies, but they also fought each other. Around 100,000 black American troops were deployed to the UK during the war. Most of the military police were white, and the local U.S. Army commanders wanted the pubs to deny access to black U.S. servicemen. The British responded by denying white American soldiers access. An example of this was when a couple of American military police got a report about some trouble at Ye Olde Hob Inn public house in Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, northern England, and went to investigate. When they found a soldier out of uniform, which means he wasn't dressed properly according to Army regulations, then the MPs argued with the black soldiers and the locals. The MPs decided not to arrest anyone and started to leave, but then someone threw a bottle at the MP's jeep. More military police arrived armed with machine guns and grenades, and black soldiers armed themselves with rifles from their base armory. This started an armed escalation that ended with a black soldier, Private William Crossland, being killed, and there were wounded on both sides, after gunfire was exchanged through the night. A later court-martial convicted 32 black soldiers of mutiny and other related crimes, but most of the sentences were lessened later, and some soldiers returned to active duty. Much more could be said about this story, but that'll suffice for now. Whenever American soldiers walked in public or hitched a ride on the back of a truck while in Great Britain, there usually were a flock of children who'd yell, "Got any gum, chum?" Yanks had access to chocolate bars and candy, and sometimes lots of it, which they freely threw out to kids, sometimes even if they didn't ask. Christmas is a special time for children. War and all its deprivations shouldn't stop children from enjoying the most wonderful time of the year. American soldiers felt compassion for war orphans and school children around their camps and air bases. They tried to make Christmas as enjoyable as possible by inviting them to parties, while remembering their past celebrations in the States and all the kids back home. Gifts were usually homemade and practical, and children's toys were often made from recycled materials. GIs would hang chaff, which were shiny strips of metallic foil thrown from their aircraft to confuse German radar, from Christmas trees, as well as more traditional items like colored lights and streamers. For some of these young children, Christmas was a particularly difficult time, as some of them were not only spending the holidays away from home, but some of them also had lost a parent, either in action or as a result of the Blitz. Christmas parties were thrown for school children on bases and town halls, and youngsters were each given a gift from Santa, who amazingly had an American accent. Everyone was served an immense amount of food, whether it was cakes, jellies, and also many sweet dishes that hadn't been seen in years due to war rationing. American soldiers and airmen were given the day off along with extra Christmas ration packages, and were encouraged to accept one of the many British invitations to a Christmas dinner. Posters were put up around bases bearing the message, "GIs, spend your Christmas at home with a British family." This was a chance to share rations with the locals who still had a lot of spirit, but not as much food as in the past. They filled the chairs left empty by British soldiers fighting abroad. The ration packages contained fruit juice, bacon, evaporated milk, coffee, rice, peas, and lard, all of which were very hard to find for a normal British household at that time. Bearing Christmas gifts of much sought-after extra rations, cigarettes, Coca-Cola, chewing gum, and nylon stockings, it is no wonder that American GIs were popular house guests among British families during the Second World War. To give a typical example of a Christmas dinner, according to historian Juliet Gardner, an American soldier arrived on a bicycle at the home of a woman in the Land Army, laden down with his rations of Spam, powdered coffee, chocolate, and soap, along with other items from his camp stores. They all had a festive dinner with plum pudding at the end, and the soldier found the silver sixpence that the English traditionally put in the pudding. Along with their rations, the GIs were also responsible for bringing many festive early 20th century traditions into British homes, while in exchange, the Brits introduced their guests to Advent calendars and Advent candles. Some British families welcomed American soldiers into their homes not just for Christmas, but for the duration of their time in Great Britain. A good example of this was First Lieutenant Dick Winters of Band of Brothers fame, who was housed in an elderly British couple's home. He thought of them as family, and they returned the feelings of affection. Even after the war was over in Europe, he visited them again before leaving for the United States. When most of the American soldiers started packing and gearing up for D-Day, many British people came out to wave and wish them well. Some American soldiers found that they preferred British women over American women and saw them as delightful in spirit. To relieve boredom and increase morale, even though the country was at war, American soldiers would throw parties and invite other Allied servicemen and the locals, but especially the women, because they needed dance partners. The regular dances held at American bases spread the popularity of R&B, blues, and jazz. Such edgy music was never played on the BBC. GIs liked calling out to the girls in the village street saying things like, "Hi, good lookin'," or "Hiya, babe." American veteran Lester Gator recalled, "We would crash their parties, drink their beer, flirt with their women." The flirtatious nature of the average American soldier charmed many British women, and their generous nature made them alluring. However, any British women who spent too much time with GIs were sometimes called Yankee bags. GIs injected much-needed money into the local economy, which brought some relief from the misery of wartime. Somehow, wherever there were American soldiers, inevitably little babies started popping up. American soldiers were far away from home, and those pretty British girls were literally close at hand. Many families were wise enough to warn their daughters to keep away from those strange Yanks, telling them that they would just have their wicked way with them, and then move along down the road. Of course, this did happen, but then many American soldiers had a Christian sense of morality and married them. As mentioned in my earlier video, there were tens of thousands of war brides that came home to the United States after the war. One estimate puts it that at least 9,000 GI babies were born out of wedlock in the United Kingdom during the war, but the figure could be much higher due to the shame and cover-ups of the time. Of course, some of the babies were of mixed-race heritage, and they almost always stayed in Great Britain after the war. Some of them weren't treated much differently than other children while growing up, according to one report. One of the biggest cultural differences that American soldiers found perplexing was the British soldiers' desire to make tea in the middle of a battle. They noticed that if there even seemed to be a 10-minute lull in the fighting, then British soldiers would break out the kettle and start brewing. This absolutely mystified American soldiers, not just because Americans generally preferred coffee, but because the enemy was nearby and periodically shooting at the Allies, and the British were over there laughing and enjoying a tea break. What's more amazing is that this didn't just happen in World War II, but it still happens in modern-day British-American war exercises. The British now have a boiling vessel or kettle built into every modern tank for protection while they're brewing up. Supposedly, British tankers can also make a grilled cheese sandwich on a heating pad too. They learned this lesson from World War II when British lives were lost while taking a break and making tea. The modern name for this is the cooking vessel. British tank crewmen have called this the most important piece of equipment on the tank. Another type of kettle was developed during the war as well, the Benghazi burner. It was little more than a steel fuel can, cleaned out and used for boiling water over a fire. One American soldier complained that British troops blocked the road by not moving their vehicles out of the way, because it was tea time. Many U.S. troops thought that the British would rather drink tea than fight a battle. Many British soldiers have stated that they couldn't imagine going into battle or exercises without tea, or even going a full day without it. One modern former British soldier stated that he could put up with a lot of crap as long as there was tea and a banjo. A banjo is a British sandwich on toasted bread with butter and a fried egg on it. The reason why it's called a banjo is because when you eat the yolk portion, it almost always runs onto your uniform and you look like you're playing the banjo. Some people may not believe this, but one American glider pilot reported that when he was flying British paratroops over the English Channel for the D-Day airborne landings, the British had set up an open fire and were brewing up tea on the floor. Keep in mind that those gliders were made of wood, canvas, and not much else, all extremely flimsy and flammable. Another American misunderstanding was that when the Brits rang a bell and yelled that it was tea time, they really meant that it was dinner time, which also included tea. For some American soldiers, it took a little while to get used to having beer that wasn't ice cold. U.S. servicemen were spoiled by what they were given and didn't understand the hardships that their fellow Allied troops were enduring. They complained that they were getting chicken again for dinner, when many British soldiers hadn't eaten chicken in 3 years that hadn't come out of a can as soup. American soldiers sometimes couldn't understand the British sense of humor, which could be dry and sarcastic. American soldiers tended to be more direct and straightforward in their communications, which could sometimes be seen as brash or insensitive by the British. This could lead to misunderstandings or hurt feelings on both sides. Despite American soldiers' preference for coffee, they sometimes would accept an offer of hot tea on the battlefield. Tea with its caffeine and the nicotine from a cigarette certainly would give a tired soldier a temporary jolt. Even the Wehrmacht knew how to take advantage of tea time. A German Red Cross man, who drove a small rover near English-held territory, stated that they would camp out and cover their rover with leaves to avoid being spotted by English fighter planes during the day. But at 5:30 p.m., all the British fighters would head back to their bases for tea, and they would uncover the rover and advance as fast as they could for an hour. They would then stop under a tree and cover the rover up again. By the way, for any British people who might visit the United States, if an American says that they have to hurry to make their tea time, they mean that they have a golf appointment on the course. In general, Americans understood that the British people had been through the ringer for several years before the U.S. soldiers arrived. They had admiration for the RAF and their performance in the Battle of Britain. They also understood that the campaigns in France and Africa were fought with huge disadvantages. Many American soldiers admired the bravery and determination of their British counterparts, especially in the early years of the war when Britain stood alone against the Axis. British soldiers were seen as tough and experienced fighters, with a long history of military tradition and discipline. Some American soldiers were very disgruntled that they were being sent to Europe when they thought they should have been focusing on fighting Japan. There were many battles where British and American soldiers fought near each other. To give some examples, there were the ending battles of North Africa, Sicily, the Italian campaign, D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and the Battle of the Bulge. On the front lines, any American soldier could sleep well at night knowing that a British unit was on their flank. As even German generals had pointed out, British soldiers were absolutely tenacious in defense of a position. One American soldier, of the 335th Infantry Regiment of the 84th Infantry Division, fought alongside British soldiers under Field Marshal Montgomery in Belgium and northern Germany. He found the British were incredibly poised and professional while frustratingly rigid to their timetables and procedures. He said he never saw so many men going about their battlefield tasks so calmly and purposefully. One issue that continuously caused friction was the difference in military tactics and doctrine. The Brits were much more professional, and he could set his watch by their progress. But they were also very steady and predictable. British officers favored a more cautious, methodical approach to battle, whereas the Americans often preferred a more aggressive, go-for-broke style of fighting. This could lead to misunderstandings and conflicts on the battlefield, as well as disagreements over strategy and tactics at the higher levels of command. Many regular GIs didn't like the formality of the British Army. Americans wanted to fly by the seat of their pants, be aggressive, and take calculated risk, but the British military system was more by the book. American soldiers were willing to advance into the unknown due to their initial inexperience and attitude. In North Africa, American soldiers found out the hard way that tanks separated from infantry could be smashed in minutes. Most American soldiers didn't like the British officer corps. They believed that British generals were too conservative at times and too aggressive at other times. In Europe, this was focused on Field Marshal Montgomery. They thought Operation Market Garden was ill-conceived and that they had to pay for the same real estate twice, which went against the U.S. Army mindset. Another full video could be made on this subject because it's so deep, but we'll just leave it at that for now. German generals could usually figure out what the British would likely do in a certain battlefield situation because they were so predictable. Americans absolutely befuddled them. One day the Americans would easily be fooled by a trick and give up a position and muddle around the battlefield, but then the next day they would attack like hurricanes to exploit a vulnerability, and almost nothing could withstand them. American soldiers felt that if it worked, then they'd use it, whereas the British probably wouldn't be so flexible unless given direct orders to do so. American soldiers found that the British Tommy was almost always polite and courteous. American soldiers respected the British consistent grim determination to get the job done and do it well. Another source of tension was the difference in social class between the two groups. British soldiers often came from working class backgrounds and had a strong sense of class identity, whereas American soldiers tended to be more egalitarian and less concerned with social status. This could lead to misunderstandings and cultural clashes, particularly when it came to issues of discipline and respect for authority. American soldiers were taught that when a surprise happens, such as a near ambush, the solution is to aggressively charge through it. Tommies were taught to hold up until further instructions were received. Of course, they didn't have the same resources that the Americans did. Another perplexing thing to GIs, British soldiers were so neat on the battlefield. American soldiers would throw everything on the ground: trash, used sea ration cans, gas mask, brass, everything that couldn't be carried would be discarded. British soldiers would clean up the battlefield and collect all the brass. Now, to be fair to the British, American soldiers probably didn't think or care about the fact that the cleaned up brass could be recycled and reused to make new shells. After the D-Day landings, American and British soldiers continued to fight together for the remainder of the war, often in difficult and challenging circumstances. One example was the Battle of the Bulge from December 1944 to January 1945, when German forces launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest in Belgium. American and British troops fought side by side in this battle, which was one of the toughest of the entire war. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the Allies were ultimately able to repel the German attack and go on to win the war. Throughout the war, American and British soldiers also shared many of the same experiences and challenges. They faced long periods of hardship and deprivation, as well as the constant threat of injury and death. They also had to deal with issues of morale, homesickness, and the stress of being away from their families for long periods of time. GIs admired the British soldiers' bravery and courage in the face of danger. Each side found the differences to be more of a source of amusement rather than a problem. Generally, there was a mutual appreciation for each other, and each could find humor in their differences. In the end, American soldiers generally had the utmost respect for their British brothers in arms. Since the beginning of the 20th century, they have been a great ally and have always been there when we asked. If you liked the video you just watched, then you may like these two other videos from Immersis Tech.